Hey guys, tonight we step into a room that smells like dust and sun-baked clay, where the air feels a little cooler than it should, and the only sound is your own slow breathing and the soft scratch of a reed stylus that isn't really there, but somehow you can almost hear it anyway. You're holding the idea that Sumerian records might hint at worlds that feel older than ours, and you let it sit in your hands like a warm mug, not as a conclusion, but as a curious possibility. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Most historians agree that Sumer wrote early city records, and king lists and archaeology suggests those tablets were made for practical life, but historians debate how much myth and symbolism is folded into the lines. You probably won't survive this, by the way, not because it's scary, but because your attention span is going to try to wander off and start checking your phone like a little raccoon looking for shiny snacks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there, because I love imagining this story drifting across different time zones like a slow-moving cloud. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a city that feels both familiar and impossibly far away. The ground under your feet is hard-packed earth, the kind that holds the day's warmth and releases it slowly into the evening. Somewhere nearby, water moves in a steady, indifferent way, not roaring, just sliding like it has places to be, and no interest in your questions. Most historians agree that the earliest cities in southern Mesopotamia grew along rivers and canals, and that people did not wake up one morning and decide to invent civilization like it was a new hobby. The evidence we do have points to gradual change, tiny steps, many hands, long seasons, and a lot of arguments about who owes who a sack of barley. And yet, you are here because of a particular itch in the human mind. It's the itch that whispers, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm? You are not proving anything tonight, you are following clues. A careful reading might suggest that some ancient texts feel like they are remembering more than they can plainly say, like a person who starts to tell you about their childhood and then pauses because the memory comes with too much weather attached. You walk toward a low building with a narrow doorway. Inside, the air is cooler and your footsteps soften. There are shelves, and on those shelves are small lumps of clay, each one pressed with wedges and lines. Most historians agree that cuneiform writing emerges as a tool for counting and managing resources. Archaeology suggests that the earliest tablets are practical lists of goods, rations, labour fields, sheep, beer. Very glamorous, right? Nothing says romance like inventory management. If you want a love letter from the dawn of cities, it might read, I gave you 2 jars of oil. Please stop borrowing my donkey. But in the middle of the ordinary, there is a strange kind of power. Because once you can mark things down, you can also mark stories down. And once a story is marked down, it can outlive the person who told it. One interpretation is that writing did not just record what people had, but also what they feared, what they hoped for, and what they wanted to be remembered. That is where the miss begins. That is where you have to walk slowly because the ground is mixed. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You pick up a tablet in your imagination. It is not heavy, but it has presence. The clay is sun-dried or fired, and the surface is slightly uneven, like the skin of baked bread. You can almost feel the shallow wedge marks under your thumb. The smell is faintly earthy. The sound of the fan in your room blends with the imagined hush of this ancient archive, and for a moment time feels like it has folded in half. Most historians agree that one of the famous genres of these texts is the king list, a record of rulers and dynasties. The evidence we do have points to it being a mix of political memory, legitimation, and tradition, not a modern history book with footnotes. And here is where the interesting discomfort begins, because the list contains parts that look like recognizable city names and dynasties, and then it drifts into reigns so long they feel like a joke told with a straight face. A careful reading might suggest the long reigns are symbolic, or that they reflect mythic time rather than calendar time. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Historians still argue whether those exaggerated reign lengths were ever meant to be taken literally, or whether they were always a poetic way of saying this was the deep past, the time when everything was bigger, stranger, and less like you. Scholars continue to debate what the compilers were trying to accomplish. And there's no full consensus, because the ancient world did not leave us a neat instruction manual titled How to Read Our Metaphors. Now you let the main title of tonight's journey settle in your mind, like dust floating through lamplight. We are the seventh civilization. Sumerian records show 6 advanced societies before ours. On the documented side, what's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian scribes sometimes organized time into eras of before and after major events, including floods, dynastic changes and shifts in divine favor within mythic frameworks. On the interpreted side, one interpretation is that later people used the language of ages to make sense of discontinuity, to explain why the world felt different after disaster. And on the imagined side, you allow yourself a calm cinematic thought. What if those age boundaries were memories of real breaks in human life? Moments when communities vanished and later communities rebuilt, inheriting not a perfect blueprint, but scraps of knowledge, habits and tools. You step outside again, and the evening air smells of reeds, damp earth and smoke from cooking fires. You see people moving with baskets. You hear a donkey complain, the original podcast host always braying at the wrong time. And you look toward the river, because rivers in this story are like a recurring character patient, and dangerous and generous, the kind of character you can never fully trust. Archaeology suggests that floods were real and common in the region, sometimes destructive, sometimes just part of life. The evidence we do have points to layers of silt in certain archaeological contexts, and to the simple fact that rivers in flat lands wander and misbehave. A more cautious explanation could be that flood stories grow from repeated local events stitched into one big tale because human memory likes a single dramatic narrative. But then the mist comes back softly. A fringe idea proposes that flood myths preserve a memory of a single world-ending catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has stuck around in popular imagination because it gives the past a clean edge, a line you can draw, a moment you can point to. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less like a claim and more like a mood. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the flood is not just water, but a symbol of reset of the way life can be interrupted and then awkwardly restarted? You walk along a canal bank. The water reflects the last light. Somewhere a child laughs. Somewhere someone argues about a boundary stone. You can almost see the first bureaucrat in history sighing deeply and reaching for another tablet because somebody miscounted again. You smile just a little because the earliest cities were not just temples and kings. They were also complaints, paperwork, spilled grain, and the daily chaos of humans trying to coordinate with other humans. Most historians agree that complex society brings organisation, specialisation, and social hierarchy. Archaeology suggests that temples and palaces played major roles in storing goods, managing labour, and shaping urban life. The evidence we do have points to real administrative systems, not just legends. And yet, the archive pulls at you. You are holding that tablet idea again. It's possible that when scribes copied older traditions, they preserved phrases and structures that were already old to them. That is not mystical, it is normal human culture. We inherit stories the way we inherit recipes. Someone says, "My grandmother used to do it this way," and the reason might be lost, but the habit survives. One interpretation is that certain mythic lists of kings or ages could be doing the same thing, preserving an old pattern of thinking about time, order, and collapse. Now imagine gently a shelf that has been rearranged many times. Some tablets are missing, some are cracked, some are reused, some are only known because later copies mention them. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in many cases here, the evidence is thin because clay survives. But not everything survives, and not everything that survives is readable, and not everything readable is straightforward. You pause and you listen for that stylus scratch again. The soft sound that has become a little motif for tonight, like a metronome for your thoughts. A reed stylus presses into wet clay, leaving a mark that dries, hardens, and waits. Most historians agree that this is one of the great turning points in human history, because writing allows memory to travel beyond the brain. Archaeology suggests that the spread of writing changes administration, trade law, and literature. The evidence we do have points to a world where words start to become objects. Now for the gentle question that sits at the centre of our first section. If writing can preserve a memory, what kind of memory would it preserve about worlds before the world you live in? The mainstream answer is practical and modest. It would preserve dynasties, rituals, myths, and the shape of society as the scribes knew it. The interpreted answer leans in a bit closer. A careful reading might suggest that some lines feel like they are compressing layers of time, talking about beginnings, endings, and returns, and the imagined answer is quiet and cinematic, not as a declaration, but as a bedtime thought. What if those layers are the echo of multiple human starts, not 6 gleaming lost empires with laser tools, but 6 times people built, lost, and rebuilt, leaving faint fingerprints in story? Historians still argue whether the ancient compilers of these lists and myths were trying to describe events or meaning or political legitimacy, or all three at once. And that debate matters because it keeps us honest. It reminds you that you can enjoy mystery without pretending it is certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The idea of 6 advanced societies before ours is not a mainstream conclusion. It is at best a way to read symbolism, a way to frame discontinuities, a way to ask why ancient texts sometimes talk like the world has had multiple chapters. You keep walking and the night deepens. Somewhere a lamp flickers in a doorway. Somewhere a dog sighs and curls into itself like it has solved every philosophical problem already. You listen to the fan and you listen to the imagined water, and you let your mind drift into the archive again, because the archive is where the solid ground and the mist touch, and where your curiosity can live without needing to win an argument. And as you pass the shelves one more time, you notice something small and almost silly, but it sticks. On the edge of a tablet near the corner there is a smudge like someone's thumb pressed there while the clay was still soft, a tiny human mark. A reminder that behind every grand idea there was a person who needed their hands to do the work. Maybe that person was tired. Maybe they were annoyed. Maybe they were thinking about dinner. Or maybe, just maybe, they were also wondering if the world had been older than anyone could remember, and if the clay could hold that thought for a while. You step out into the open air and feel the land flatten around you wide and patient, like it has been pressed by a giant palm. The sky is big, the kind of sky that makes you stand a little straighter without realizing it. In the distance, the river glints, not flashy, just steady like a long piece of metal left in the sun. Most historians agree that the earliest cities in southern Mesopotamia didn't appear out of nowhere. Archaeology suggests they rose gradually as farming intensified, populations clustered, and irrigation networks expanded. The evidence we do have points to canals, fields, storehouses, and the slow invention of rules, because once you have a lot of grain in one place, somebody always wants to borrow it permanently. You walk along an earthen embankment that borders a canal. The water is calm, but you can tell it has opinions. It smells of wet reeds and silt, and there's a faint sweetness too, like crushed plants, warmed by the day. You notice footprints in the mud, some bare, some sandal-shaped, and you realize how much of this world is built with feet and patience. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian life depended on managing water in a landscape where rain is unreliable. Archaeology suggests that irrigation was both a gift and a constant headache. The evidence we do have points to communities coordinating labour to dig, maintain, and police canals because water brings crops. but it also brings disputes that can last longer than the crops. And in that practical struggle, cities start to feel inevitable, not destined by magic, but pulled into being by needs and opportunities. You pass a cluster of mud brick houses, smoke curls from a cooking area, a pot bubbles quietly, and it smells like something starchy and comforting. Someone is grinding grain, and the rhythm is almost hypnotic, like a slow drum that tells your brain it can relax. You hear a goat complain, because goats are basically tiny critics with horns. You keep walking and you begin to sense the shape of an urban place. Streets, courtyards, workshops, people calling out donkeys, hauling, children running, and stopping just long enough to look at you like you're the strange one. Most historians agree that cities like Uruk become major urban centres early in Mesopotamian history. Archaeology suggests that as settlements grow, specialised labour grows with them: potters, metal workers, weavers, builders, scribes. The evidence we do have points to temples and administrative buildings, and to the way central institutions could coordinate work and distribute rations. You can almost hear the day's announcements like a sleepy town crier reading a grocery list. Today, barley allocations, labour assignments, who is repairing the canal gate, and who is absolutely not allowed to borrow the temple's ox again. You move toward the river's edge, where boats sit low in the water, their reeds tied and woven, their wood dark with use. You smell fish and wet rope. Trade is here too quietly. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamia traded widely because it lacked many raw materials. Archaeology suggests that goods like stone timber, copper and precious materials moved across long distances. The evidence we do have points to exchange networks that connect regions and cultures. And there is something very human about that, because even in the ancient world, somebody was always thinking, if I can just get my hands on a better tool or a prettier stone or a stronger metal, my life will improve. You can call it progress or you can call it shopping. Same impulse, different sandals. Now, as your steps settle into a slow pace, you let the title idea return in a gentler, more grounded way. The phrase 7 civilizations can sound like a dramatic staircase. 6 steps behind you, 1 step under you, and the future step you don't want to look down from. But what's broadly accepted is simpler human societies have risen in many places over many millennia with different levels of complexity and technology. A more cautious explanation could be that the 6 before ours idea is a modern framing laid over ancient ways of talking about time. It's possible that ancient texts describe ages or worlds not as literal separate civilizations with identical profiles, but as moral or cosmic phases that help people make sense of change. Historians still argue whether the way Mesopotamian texts divide the past into eras reflects actual remembered disruptions or mostly symbolic storytelling. That debate sits right beside you like a quiet companion, because rivers do bring real disruptions. A canal breaks fields, flood crops, fail families, move cities, decline, new centres rise. The evidence we do have points to cycles of growth and stress, sometimes linked to climate shifts, political conflict, or changing trade routes. Archaeology suggests that even strong cities could weaken under pressure, and that the landscape itself can change the game. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient people talk about before and after in mythic terms, they could be reflecting lived experience of these disruptions, but describing them in a language that feels bigger than daily life. You stop at a place where the canal widens. The water moves slower here, and the surface is dotted with tiny ripples. A bird stands on one leg in the shallows, like it's meditating, or like it's trying to remember where it left its keys. You watch it for a moment and let your own thoughts slow down. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What we can say with more confidence is that Mesopotamian communities faced environmental challenges and adapted through engineering, social organisation, and belief systems that made sense of hardship. You walk again, and as you approach the city centre, the sound changes. More voices, more footsteps, more clinking of tools. You pass a workshop where someone shapes clay on a simple wheel, and you watch the vessel rise from spinning mud like a quiet miracle. Most historians agree that pottery and craft production become increasingly specialised in early cities. Archaeology suggests that standardised forms can reflect centralised distribution systems. The evidence we do have points to a society learning how to scale, how to make many things in predictable ways. And that's where you can feel the first faint hint of something that later people might romanticize as advanced. Not lasers, not secret machines, just systems, standard measures, repeated processes, skilled hands, shared expectations. Now you let yourself lean into one small cinematic what if carefully framed as possibility. What if some of those systems felt to later people like they had been inherited? What if a new city's leaders looked at a ruined canal line half buried in silt and thought someone knew how to do this before us? That is not far-fetched. People see old earthworks and assume older hands. It's possible that real remnants from earlier settlements inspired myths of earlier ages. A careful reading might suggest that the idea of worlds before ours could be rooted in the visible palimpsest of the land, abandoned mounds, older walls, forgotten channels, the way a city can sit on top of another city like a tired person stacking pillows. And then because humans are humans, someone tells the story bigger. A popular rumour claims that the ancestors were closer to the gods, that they lived longer, that they knew things we forgot. This theory isn't widely accepted as literal history, but it fits a pattern found in many cultures, the golden age behind you, the less perfect age you're stuck in now. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mirror, not a map. It reflects how people feel about change, loss and longing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You reach a place where the canal meets a larger channel. Wooden gates control the flow. You can see how much depends on these simple structures. How a few planks and ropes can decide whether a field thrives or dries. Archaeology suggests that water management shaped social power because someone had to decide who got water and when. Most historians agree that conflict over resources is ancient, and that cooperation is just as ancient, sometimes forced, sometimes voluntary, often both. The evidence we do have points to the idea that building a city means building agreements, and building agreements means building consequences for breaking them, which is why you can almost hear a bored official saying kindly but firmly, no, you cannot divert the canal to your cousin's field just because your cousin is having a rough season. Now the night air cools, and your shoulders relax as you keep moving through the city's pulse. You notice smell, smoke, bread, sweat, wet earth, and a faint tang of metal. You hear music in the distance, simple rhythm, maybe clapping, maybe a drum. You realise civilization is not just monuments, it is the sound of a community staying awake together, even when some people would very much like to go to bed. And as you pass a small shrine, you slow, because belief is part of this landscape too. What's broadly accepted is that religion and ritual were central to Mesopotamian city life. Archaeology suggests temples served not only spiritual roles, but economic and political ones. The evidence we do have points to offerings, festivals, and priestly administration. One interpretation is that when ancient texts talk about gods granting kingship or withdrawing it, they may be encoding shifts in political legitimacy and social stability. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Historians still argue whether mythic language about divine favour is best read as theology, propaganda, metaphor, or some mixture that changes over time. And that uncertainty is actually soothing if you let it be. It means you are allowed to wonder without having to nail everything down. You can walk through this city and feel how real it is, how physical, how practical, and also how full of stories that try to make life feel coherent. So when someone says 6 civilizations before ours, you hold it like a smooth stone. On solid ground, you have evidence of many phases of settlement, rebuilding, innovation, and collapse. On misty ground, you have myths that divide time into eras and claim the past was different. And in the gentle imagination space, you let one more question float up soft as a breath. What if each river bend hides a reset button? Not a magical button, not a cosmic switch, but the simple fact that water can erase, and water can nourish, and people keep coming back anyway. You walk with that thought as the city's lights flicker in your mind and the canal's surface turns dark, and your own breathing becomes the quiet rhythm that carries you onward. You drift deeper into the city's administrative heart, where the streets narrow and the air feels busier, thicker with human intention. A lamp burns behind a reed screen, and its light turns the dust into floating gold. Somewhere close, you hear the soft tap of clay being set down, the kind of sound that suggests an orderly mind trying to tame a disorderly world. Most historians agree that record keeping becomes central in early Mesopotamian cities, and archaeology suggests that scribes were not just writers but managers of reality. People who could turn goats and grain into neat lines. The evidence we do have points to the fact that once you can count something, you can control it. Or at least you can try, which is basically the origin story of every spreadsheet ever. Tonight, your focus tightens onto one strange and famous document that keeps tugging at the imagination. What's broadly accepted is that the Sumerian king list is a compilation that blends dynastic history with legendary material connecting cities and rulers into a single sequence. Scholars continue to debate the purpose of that compilation, and there's no full consensus on how literal it was ever meant to be. One interpretation is that it helped later kings legitimize themselves by placing their rule inside a grand narrative of continuity. Another interpretation is that it preserved older traditions that were already half mythic when they were written down. And yes, it also includes reign lengths that make you blink like you just misread a price tag. You step into a scribal space, a quiet room with low benches and shallow bowls of water used to soften clay. The smell is damp and earthy. You imagine a young apprentice wiping their hands on their tunic and trying to look confident while a senior scribe watches with the patient disappointment of someone who has seen too many crooked wedge marks. The stylus scratches, a tablet turns. Another line begins. Most historians agree that scribal training was rigorous, and archaeology suggests that schools used copying exercises and lists to teach writing. The evidence we do have points to repetition discipline and a lot of mistakes corrected in clay. And then you picture the king list being copied line by line, city by city. You see the names that feel grounded, tied to places that archaeology can locate as real ancient cities. On solid ground, you can say the text includes dynasties that align with other evidence, at least in broad strokes. And then you watch it drift into that foggy zone where reigns stretch into thousands of years, like time itself got bored and decided to nap for an extra century. A careful reading might suggest that these long reigns are symbolic, not literal. That is a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Historians still argue whether those enormous numbers reflect mythic time, scribal convention, political messaging, or a mixture that shifted across generations of copying. Some scholars propose that the list may have been edited to serve different agendas in different periods, which means the text can be both a memory and a tool. The evidence we do have points to a culture where writing is powerful and powerful things get used. Now, because you are a sensible person who wants to fall asleep, you do something gentle. You take those huge numbers and you don't panic. You don't treat them as a secret code you must crack tonight. Instead, you let them be what they might be: a storytelling device, a way of marking distance. Many cultures use exaggerated time spans to say this was the deep past, the age of heroes, the age when the world operated differently. One interpretation is that the king list is doing something similar, using impossibly long reigns to create a sense of cosmic scale. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. But then the mist offers you a tempting thought, and you take it carefully, like you would take a hot spoonful of soup. A fringe idea proposes that those reigns preserve a memory of a time when society was fundamentally different, perhaps more stable, perhaps organised around a different rhythm. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's popular because it makes the past feel like a ladder of lost grandeur. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic question instead of a claim. What if the numbers are a coded map of vanished societies? Not a map with street names, not a blueprint for a hidden machine, but a map in the sense that numbers can carry meaning beyond counting. You watch an ancient scribe choose a number, then choose another, and you wonder if the choice is arithmetic or symbolic. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamians were skilled with mathematics and measurement, especially for land trade and administrative purposes. The evidence we do have points to real numerical sophistication, and it's possible, though not certain, that some numerical patterns in texts carried cultural or religious symbolism, because humans love turning numbers into meaning. We do it now too. People see repeating digits on clocks and immediately decide the universe is winking at them. Sometimes it's just a clock. You step back from the tablet and move through a courtyard where someone is sorting reeds. The reeds are bundled, cut clean and stacked. You realise this too is part of the story. Reeds become baskets, roofs, boats, mats and styluses. Civilization is built from humble materials arranged in clever ways. Most historians agree that urban life in Mesopotamia depended on local resources shaped by labour and skill. The evidence we do have points to a society of builders and organisers, not just dreamers. Now you return to the king list in your mind, but you look at it differently. You don't stare at the big reigns like they are a scandal. You ask what they do inside the story. They separate time. They create a boundary between a mythic age and a more historical age. They tell you gently that the list is not merely a timeline. It is also a statement about order. Kingship descends. Kingship moves from city to city. The world has phases. A careful reading might suggest that this structure reflects how people experienced political change and how they wanted to frame legitimacy. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. Historians still argue whether the phrase about kingship descending from the heavens is meant as literal belief, poetic convention, or political theatre. And honestly, it could be all three depending on who is listening and when. The great trick of ancient texts is that they can serve multiple audiences at once. A king hears destiny, a scribe hears tradition, a farmer hears please pay your taxes. You pause by a wall where a relief carving catches the lamplight. It shows a figure in profile, stylized calm. You feel the distance again, the way you are looking through a narrow window into a wide world. And you remind yourself of the truth ladder, the gentle way we keep our footing, documented, interpreted, imagined. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here the evidence about literal 6 advanced civilizations is thin. What's broadly accepted is that the king list is a blend, and that the deep past it describes is heavily mythologized. Still, you are allowed to wonder, because wondering is not the same as declaring. You are not proving anything tonight, you are following clues. One interpretation is that the king list preserves an ancient mental model of cycles where order rises, order falls, and order returns. Another interpretation is that it is a political tool to connect different city-states into one grand narrative, smoothing over messy realities. And the cinematic what-if floating quietly at the edge of your thoughts is that those cycles might echo real patterns of settlement and disruption across generations, patterns that ancient people experienced as distinct worlds. You walk toward a storage area and see sealed jars lined up like silent witnesses. Each seal is pressed with a design. Someone cared enough to mark ownership, to mark authority. Most historians agree that seals and administrative markers were essential in Mesopotamian economic life. Archaeology suggests that these objects show institutional control and personal identity. The evidence we do have points to a society that values record proof and accountability, which is funny because we still struggle with that now. You can invent writing and still forget where you put your keys. Now you imagine the scribes again, their hands stained with clay, their backs a little sore, their minds tuned to order. It's possible that they copied older lists, not because they believed every detail literally, but because the lists mattered culturally. A careful reading might suggest that copying is itself a form of reverence, a way of keeping the world aligned. And in that act, some older shapes of thought survive. The number 6, the idea of eras, the sense of a layered past. So you hold the idea gently. On solid ground, the King List tells you about how Mesopotamians constructed political memory. On misty ground, the exaggerated reigns invite symbolism and speculation. And in gentle imagination, you let your mind picture a series of dawns, not necessarily 6 technologically advanced global empires, but 6 times humans built complex lives and then watched them shift or fade, leaving only the kind of traces that stories can carry. Historians still argue whether those traces are meant to be read as history myth or purposeful blending. There's no full consensus, and that's fine. Uncertainty is not failure. It is a soft place to rest your head. You listen to the quiet scratch of the stylus in your imagination, and you let the numbers on the tablet become less like a riddle and more like a lullaby of scale, reminding you that human memory has always tried to stretch beyond the length of one lifetime. You wander into a part of the city where the ground looks slightly smoother, like it has been patted down by many anxious feet. The air tastes faintly of dampness, and you notice that people here keep glancing toward the water, not in awe, but in the cautious way you look at a neighbour who throws loud parties and owns a questionable collection of fireworks. Most historians agree that rivers in southern Mesopotamia were both life-giving and disruptive. Archaeology suggests that flooding and shifting channels shaped settlement patterns, and the evidence we do have points to communities building canals, levees, and drainage to manage what could not be fully controlled. And that is where the flood enters the story, not as a single splashy event, but as a recurring memory with many layers. What's broadly accepted is that flood narratives appear across ancient Mesopotamian literature, including stories where a great flood resets the world and a survivor preserves life. The evidence we do have points to the fact that floods were a real hazard and that stories often grow from real experiences. A more cautious explanation could be that the famous Great Flood idea is a stitched tapestry woven from multiple local disasters, remembered and retold, until they feel like one definitive turning point. You stand near a low wall where the mud brick shows a faint line, a changing colour, that hints at different building phases. Even without tools, you can sense that the city has been repaired more than once. Archaeology suggests that many ancient sites contain layers of rebuilding, and that destruction and repair can come from floods, fires, abandonment, or conflict. The evidence we do have points to the simple reality that cities are not static. They are lived in, damaged, patched, expanded, and sometimes left behind, like a half-finished project you swear you will get back to someday. Now you let your mind take the documented anchor first, the solid ground. Archaeology suggests that there were significant flood events in parts of Mesopotamia at various times, and that sediment layers in some places indicate episodes of inundation. Most historians agree that these were regional, not necessarily one single global catastrophe. And when you picture those floods, you keep it sleep-friendly. No graphic scenes, no panic, just the steady, unglamorous force of water rising, creeping into courtyards, loosening bricks, turning streets into slow canals. Then you move one rung up the truth ladder into interpretation. One interpretation is that flood myths function like a cultural knot tying together memories of vulnerability and survival. A careful reading might suggest that the flood is also a moral device, a way to explain why the world changes and why humans must rebuild with humility. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Ancient storytellers might have shaped the narrative to teach lessons to honour certain gods, or to explain political shifts. And the same story can do multiple jobs because humans love a multitasking myth. Historians still argue whether flood narratives should be read primarily as historical memory, theological metaphor, or political commentary. There's no full consensus, and the uncertainty is part of what keeps the story alive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Now the misty wrung the gentle imagination comes with a whisper. What if survivors carried techniques from a lost city into the mud? Not in a dramatic superhero way, but in a practical way. A person remembers how to measure a field. Someone remembers how to line a canal. Someone remembers which plants can grow in salty soil. Someone remembers how to make a seal impression to prove ownership. That kind of knowledge is small enough to fit inside a head and valuable enough to feel like treasure when everything else is damaged. This is where a fringe idea proposes something bigger, that flood stories preserve a memory of a full societal reset, maybe even multiple resets, where advanced knowledge was repeatedly lost and partially recovered. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is a popular rumour because it makes ancient texts feel like they are winking at us through time. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens, not a scientific claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You walk toward a riverside storage area and see baskets stacked high, protected by a simple roof. You can smell grain, dry and comforting, like a pantry. Most historians agree that storing surplus was crucial to early states, and archaeology suggests that centralized storage and redistribution helped cities survive bad seasons. The evidence we do have points to the fact that a flood is not just water, it is also the sudden threat of losing stored food tools and the ability to coordinate labour. If you want to understand why the flood becomes myth, picture a whole year of planning dissolving into wet mud, and then picture the exhausting work of starting again. And starting again is the point. You watch people repair a wall brick by brick. Someone carries fresh clay. Someone presses it into shape. Someone smooths it with a wet hand. The rhythm is slow, almost calming. Civilization feels less like a monument and more like maintenance. A careful reading might suggest that some ancient tales about worlds before ours could be grounded in this lived reality. People experience a break, then rebuild, and the rebuilt world feels like a different world. When you live through enough breaks, you start counting them. Historians still argue whether the deep time language in ancient lists and myths reflects actual sequences of catastrophes or simply mythic convention, and you do not have to choose one tonight. You can hold both possibilities gently, like balancing two stones in your palm. You move toward a small shrine near the water where offerings sit in simple bowls. The smell of incense is faint, mixed with river air. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion included rituals aimed at securing stability, prosperity, and divine favour. One interpretation is that flood stories and rituals work together to help people cope with uncertainty. If you can tell a story where the flood has meaning, you can live with the fact that the river does not care about your plans. Now your mind drifts to a more personal angle because big myths always rest on small human moments. You imagine a family waking to damp floors, lifting jars onto higher shelves, moving sleeping mats, tying animals, checking neighbours. Not a cinematic disaster scene, but an ordinary emergency. And then you imagine the evening after the water recedes, when the air is thick and still, and everyone is too tired to talk, so someone tells a story quietly. A story that says, "We have been through this before." A story that says, "People survived." A story that says the world can restart. And in that quiet, you can feel why some modern listeners hear 6 civilizations before ours and think of distinct worlds separated by floods. The idea has emotional logic. It takes the mess of history and gives it chapters. But the evidence we do have points to complexity, many floods, many rebuilds, many local experiences, and a long timeline where change is often gradual, interrupted by sharper shocks. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no definitive tablet that says, here are 6 advanced global civilizations numbered neatly with technical manuals attached. That is not solid ground. Still, the flood motif remains useful because it helps you imagine continuity across discontinuity. A careful reading might suggest that flood tales are memory containers, not just about water, but about social fragility, about the dependence on systems, and about how quickly order can soften when the ground turns to slurry. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. Historians still argue whether specific flood accounts correspond to specific archaeological events or whether they are primarily literary. That debate is ongoing, and it keeps your feet planted. And then with your feet planted, you allow the mist to do its gentle work. What if the flood is not a single event, but a repeating doorway? Each time it opens, some things pass through and some do not. Tools survive. Songs survive. A few lines of writing survive. The shape of a seal survives. And then someone generations later looks at those surviving scraps and feels like they have inherited a world. You breathe slowly. The fan hums. The river in your imagination slides along indifferent, patient, always moving. And you walk away from the water with a calm, grounded thought. The documented past gives you floods and rebuilds. Interpretation gives you symbols and chapters. Gentle imagination gives you the cinematic feeling of a reset, the kind that makes you wonder if every civilization, including ours, is less a single climb and more a series of restarts. You find yourself in a quieter lane where the noise of the marketplace fades into a soft murmur, like someone turned the volume knob down just enough for your brain to unclench. The air smells of wet clay and warm straw. A small courtyard opens ahead, and inside it you see the simplest kind of miracle, a lump of mud becoming a message. Most historians agree that writing in Mesopotamia begins as a practical tool for administration. Archaeology suggests the earliest marks were used for counting goods and tracking transactions, and the evidence we do have points to lists, rations and deliveries. The ancient version of receipts you still lose the moment you need to return something. You step closer to the scribal work area and notice how ordinary it looks. No dramatic thunder, no glowing runes, just low benches, baskets of clay, bowls of water and reed styluses cut to a neat point. The people here are focused, shoulders slightly hunched faces, calm eyes trained on the surface of a tablet. A careful reading might suggest that this is how most revolutions happen quietly in a room where someone is trying to solve a mundane problem. How many jars of oil? How many workers today? How much grain was moved from storage? And then without anyone noticing, in the moment, the act of marking becomes the act of remembering. What's broadly accepted is that cuneiform develops over time from earlier pictographic marks into a more abstract wedge-shaped script. Archaeology suggests this change reflects both convenience and the expanding needs of record keeping. The evidence we do have points to standardization signs that become more regular formats, that become more predictable. And as you watch that process in your imagination, you realize something that feels almost funny. Humans invent cities, canals and temples, and then the thing that truly changes everything is a system of tiny wedge marks. Your ancestors built ziggurats, and the secret sauce is basically better note-taking. Now you climb one rung on the truth ladder into interpretation. One interpretation is that once writing exists for counting, it naturally gets used for other things, agreements, laws, hymns, letters, stories. A careful reading might suggest that scribes were not just recording current life, but also shaping what future generations would think the past was. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is reasonable to say that any society with writing can curate memory, and curated memory can feel like a different kind of truth than lived experience. Historians still argue whether early writing was primarily driven by economic needs or by broader cultural pressures like administration, religion, and prestige. There's no full consensus because the ancient world did not sit down to explain its motivations in a tidy interview. The evidence we do have points to multiple forces pushing together. Cities grow, surplus grows, institutions grow, and the need to track, claim, and enforce grows right along with them. You watch a scribe press the stylus into clay and lift it, leaving a clean wedge. Then another wedge, then another. The rhythm is soothing. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. You can almost feel your own breathing fall into sync, and you realize something else that is both practical and mysterious. Clay is an honest medium. It doesn't pretend. If you mess up, the mark stays. You can smooth it while it's wet, but once it dries, it becomes stubborn, which is very on brand for history. It does not vanish just because you regret it. What's broadly accepted is that writing allowed more complex administration and helped institutions manage labour and resources. Archaeology suggests that early texts record ration systems and worker lists showing organised distribution. The evidence we do have points to how city life becomes possible at scale. If a temple can track who worked and what they received, it can coordinate bigger projects. That can be stability, and it can be control depending on where you stand. Civilization is a cosy blanket until you realize someone else decides who gets the blanket. Now comes the misty part, the gentle imagination, and you hold it carefully. It's possible that scribes also copied older oral traditions, preserving patterns that were already ancient. A careful reading might suggest that certain phrases, structures, or story motifs could be echoes from earlier times carried forward because they felt right, because they were sacred, or because they were familiar. This does not require hidden technology or secret archives. It requires only that humans are creatures of habit, and that we pass down stories the way we pass down songs. A fringe idea proposes that writing itself was an inheritance, that the sudden emergence of complex record systems hints at knowledge brought from a prior advanced society. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appears often in modern speculation because it's tempting to imagine a lost teacher handing civilization a toolkit. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes more cinematic and less literal. What if a simple reed stylus becomes a time capsule? You picture a flood-damaged settlement. The water recedes, the ground dries, people rebuild. Someone finds an old token, an old seal, an old marked object. They copy the marks. They repeat them. Over time, the marks become a system. That is a plausible pathway in the broadest sense, though not something we can prove in detail for specific moments. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and the solid ground is still that writing emerges through incremental changes in known historical contexts shaped by local needs. You step outside and walk through a small market. The day is fading, but trade continues. A woman measures grain with a scoop. A man checks the weight of something shiny. A child stares at you like you are the weirdest purchase on display. Most historians agree that standard measures in accounting were crucial to early economies. Archaeology suggests that seals' weights and tablets all work together as a trust system. The evidence we do have points to a world where people needed ways to say, this is mine, this is owed, this was delivered, this was agreed. And here is a light joke for your sleepy brain. You realise the first big leap in civilization is basically the invention of receipts, contracts and bureaucracy, which means humanity's true superpower is not fire, it's paperwork. You can almost hear someone in ancient Uruk sighing because another official wants the tablet rewritten in a clearer hand. Somewhere the world's first "please see" attached is being muttered into the air, even though there is no attachment, only more clay. Now you drift back toward the scribal school where students practice signs. You imagine them repeating lists, animals, plants, tools, cities. Archaeology suggests that lexical lists were common in scribal education. And the evidence we do have points to a culture that treats knowledge as something you can train, not just something you inherit by accident. This matters for our theme tonight, because if you want to imagine 6 civilizations before ours, you must also imagine transmission. How would knowledge survive across disruptions? Writing is one answer, schools are another, oral tradition is another. And sometimes the simplest answer is that people rebuild from scratch more often than we like to admit. Historians still argue whether the earliest scribes understood themselves as historians, administrators, priests, or something that blends all 3 roles. That debate matters because it shapes how you read what they wrote. A king list is not the same as a ration list, and a hymn is not the same as a legal contract. Yet the same people might copy all of them. One interpretation is that scribes were guardians of order, and that order included both the economic and the cosmic. If you can list goats, you can also list kings. If you can record debts, you can also record myths. And in that overlap, memory becomes layered. You slow down near a doorway where a tablet is drying in the open air. The surface still looks slightly damp. The wedge marks catch the light. You see how fragile it is at this stage, how easy it would be to smear. And then you see how durable it becomes once it hardens. This is a small, quiet metaphor for our whole journey. Some parts of the past are soft and smudged. Some parts are hard and stubborn. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And even when the evidence is thick, it still needs interpretation because marks do not speak without a reader. So you carry forward the reed stylus as a motif, a little tool that feels humble enough to trust. On solid ground, it tells you writing grew from practical needs. On misty ground, it invites the thought that older patterns might be preserved in copied forms, and in gentle imagination it becomes a candle flame in a long hallway of time, lighting up the possibility that even if worlds ended and restarted, some marks might have survived and some minds might have kept the rhythm of knowledge alive. You wander toward the city's tallest silhouette where the air seems to shift, as if the buildings themselves are inhaling. The ground under your feet feels more compact here, trampled by processions, carts, and the steady traffic of people who have errands that sound holy, but are still at the core errands. Most historians agree that temples were central institutions in many Mesopotamian cities. Archaeology suggests that temples served religious purposes while also functioning as economic hubs, and the evidence we do have points to storehouses, workshops, and administrative tablets clustered around sacred precincts. You approach the temple courtyard and feel a calm pressure in the atmosphere, like you are stepping into a place where everyone tries to behave slightly better, even if only because someone important is watching. Incense lingers in the air. You hear murmured voices, the soft shuffle of sandals, the clink of a jar being set down. The scene is orderly in a way that feels both comforting and honestly a little controlling. Like a library where the librarian is also the tax collector. What's broadly accepted is that temples managed offerings, redistributed goods, and organised labour for projects that required coordination. Archaeology suggests that these institutions kept records of rations, land, and workers. The evidence we do have points to a society where sacred and administrative life were braided together. A careful reading might suggest that when a temple says a god owns the land, it can also mean the institution that represents the god has a claim over resources. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because ancient belief is not just a mask for politics. People genuinely believed, but belief and power can share a roof. Now you let your attention settle on the numbers because temples bring you right into the world of counting. You can almost see scribes in shaded corners, styluses moving tablets, stacking a rhythm of documentation that never fully stops. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamians used standardized measures and developed sophisticated accounting practices. The evidence we do have points to systems measurements of grain, beer oil, land, and labour. And when you look at those systems, you understand why some modern minds start to wonder about inheritance. A well-run temple economy can look almost modern in its logic. Almost. Then you remember the whole thing is still fueled by human patience and the occasional donkey. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian mathematics included practical arithmetic for trade and land measurement, and that they used a sexagesimal base for some calculations, which is part of why we still divide hours and circles the way we do. That is a mainstream historical fact that feels like a little time-travelling handshake. You glance at the imagined sky and think, wow, even your clock is carrying an old echo. You also think, please do not tell my clock it's ancient. It already acts dramatic when the battery is low. Now the truth ladder invites you up into interpretation. One interpretation is that priestly mathematics and temple record systems could reflect accumulated knowledge across generations, refined through repetition. A careful reading might suggest that some numerical patterns in ritual calendars or administrative texts might carry symbolic meaning as well as practical function. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Numbers can be both tools and stories. They can measure a field and also measure a worldview. Historians still argue whether the strongest driver of mathematical development in Mesopotamia was administrative necessity, astronomical observation, or ritual tradition. There's no full consensus, and it may be all three because humans rarely evolve one skill for only one reason. You measure to trade. You measure to build. You measure to time festivals. You measure to predict seasons. And soon your measuring becomes culture. You move closer to the temple platform, where steps rise in a steady climb. Each step is worn smooth. You can smell sun-warmed brick and the faint tang of bitumen. People move carefully here, carrying offerings, baskets and jars. The higher you climb, the more the city spreads out behind you like a woven mat of rooftops and courtyards. This is a good place to understand why temples become centres. They literally and figuratively sit above daily life. You reach a landing and pause, letting the view calm your mind. The fan hum in your room blends with the imagined wind across the roofline, and your thoughts slow into a gentle drift. Now comes the quirky tidbit, and you get it with a wink rather than a punch. A popular rumour claims that ancient temple priests had secret advanced formulas that later ages forgot, and that their numbers were less bookkeeping and more hidden science. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because humans love the idea of a locked cabinet of knowledge. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a question about how expertise feels from the outside. When you cannot read the tablets, the scribe looks like a wizard. When you cannot understand the calendar, the priest looks like a timekeeper of the universe. Sometimes the magic is simply literacy plus a good organisational system. Archaeology suggests that many temple records are extremely practical, which is both reassuring and slightly disappointing if you came for cosmic secrets. But you can find mystery even in practical texts, because practical texts show you how the machine of society runs. And society is a machine not made of metal, but made of agreements, obligations and habits. Now you reach the gentle imagination rung, and you keep your voice soft about it. What if those neat columns of numbers come from a pre-Sumerian playbook? Not in the sense of a lost super civilization handing down spreadsheets from the sky, but in the sense that communities inherit techniques from the people who lived nearby and earlier. You look down at the landscape around the city. You notice old mounds, older walls half absorbed into later construction. It's possible that temple administrators, like all skilled workers, learned from what existed, improved it and passed it on. A careful reading might suggest that some knowledge streams can survive disruptions because they are embedded in routine: how to measure grain, how to allocate rations, how to schedule labour, how to mark a container with a seal. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian institutional complexity is best explained by gradual internal development or by occasional bursts triggered by external influences like trade migration or competition between cities. There's no full consensus, and the debate keeps your mind balanced. The evidence we do have points to a long process with innovations accumulating, and yet it's possible that the lived experience of those bursts felt like inheritance. 1 year you're a small settlement, 2 generations later you're an urban centre with a temple economy and scribal schools. That can feel like a jump. You step into a shaded room where officials receive goods. People bring offerings and taxes. Though they might call it tribute to make it sound more spiritual, a scribe watches, another scribe records, a seal is rolled on wet clay, leaving a crisp pattern. You realize how much trust is being manufactured here. A careful reading might suggest that temples stabilize society by creating predictable systems. Predictability is a kind of technology. It is not glamorous, but it changes everything. You can sleep at night if you believe the grain will be stored, the canal maintained, the festival held, the gods appeased, and the rations distributed. You can also get very annoyed if your ration is late, which is probably why complaining is also a timeless human tradition. Now for a light joke to keep your brain from wandering. You imagine a temple accountant looking at a pile of tablets and thinking, I did not sign up for this. Then you remember technically nobody signed up. They just got assigned. Civilization, the original group project where one person does all the work and everyone else says we contributed spiritually. What's broadly accepted is that temples were monumental and symbolic, and that they were built and maintained through large-scale labour. Archaeology suggests that organising such labour required systems of distribution and management. The evidence we do have points to a feedback loop. Temples gain resources, resources fund projects, projects reinforce temple prestige, prestige draws more offerings. It is a steady cycle. Now you let the central theme float through this temple space without turning into a hard claim. The idea of multiple civilizations before ours can be held as a metaphor for cycles of building and rebuilding, and for layers of knowledge that feel older than any one generation. One interpretation is that temple institutions preserve continuity across political change because they outlast individual rulers. Another interpretation is that rituals and calendars preserve patterns that can seem timeless, and then the cinematic what if, carefully framed, becomes gentle. What if there really were previous human phases, previous chapters where systems rose and fell, and temples in later times echoed older structures without fully remembering why? Historians still argue whether myths of earlier ages reflect actual cultural memories of collapse or are primarily narrative devices. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is where your mind can rest without strain. You take a slow breath. You listen for the quiet scratch of stylus in the background of your imagination. You look out from the temple height and see the city lights flicker like small fireflies trapped in clay houses. And you carry one practical truth with you as you drift onward. Advanced is not always shiny. Sometimes it is the ability to count to, plan to store, to coordinate, to keep promises, to enforce rules, and to keep the river from stealing everything while everyone tries to sleep. You step down from the temple precinct and follow a street that smells like sun-warmed rope leather and something smoky that could be dinner or could be somebody's questionable life choice. The city's centre fades behind you as you move toward the edges, where the walls feel thinner and the horizon opens. You hear the low creak of carts. You hear voices calling out numbers. You hear the gentle slap of water against a wooden hull. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities depended on trade. because the river plain lacked many raw materials. Archaeology suggests that networks connected Mesopotamia to regions with stone, timber, copper, and luxury goods, and the evidence we do have points to exchange that reaches farther than you might expect for a world without engines, GPS, or the option to order something arriving tomorrow with a single click. You arrive at a riverside landing and the whole place feels like movement made visible. Boats sit low in the water. Bundles of reed and wood are stacked. Jars are sealed. Someone checks a list. Someone else checks the person checking the list, because that is how humans show love, by double checking. The air is damp, cool, and layered with smells, fish tar, sweat, and fresh cut plants. What's broadly accepted is that river transport was crucial for moving goods efficiently. Archaeology suggests that both riverine and overland trade routes carried materials in and out of southern Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have points to an economy that is not isolated, not sealed, but threaded into a wider world. Now your mind naturally starts to imagine the routes. A caravan line stretching across dry land. A boat gliding along a canal that feeds into a river. A trader stepping into a city with a foreign accent. A different style of sandals, and a face that tells a different set of stories. Most historians agree that long-distance trade existed early and expanded over time, and archaeology suggests that objects found in Mesopotamia sometimes come from faraway sources. The evidence we do have points to contact movement and exchange of ideas alongside goods, even if we cannot always trace exactly how and when every influence travelled. And here is where interpretation slips in with a gentle tilt of the head. One interpretation is that trade networks can make innovation seem sudden, because when a new material or technique arrives, it can change local life quickly. A more cautious explanation could be that what looks like a leap is often a blend, local experimentation, plus imported ideas, plus the pressure to compete with neighbouring cities. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because the relative weight of internal development versus outside influence is one of those questions that keeps historians quietly busy for generations. Historians still argue whether major shifts in Mesopotamian complexity were primarily driven by internal social evolution or by interactions with other regions. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is helpful for our theme tonight because it keeps the door open without letting the wind blow the house down. You can acknowledge contact and influence without turning it into a secret visitor narrative. Now the misty rung arrives and you treat it gently. A popular rumour claims that ancient trade routes carried more than goods, that they carried fragments of advanced knowledge from lost societies. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's easy to see why it feels compelling. If you hold a piece of copper that came from far away, it already feels like a message from another world. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can ask a cinematic question instead of making a claim. What if caravans once followed routes drawn by an older world? Not literally drawn on a surviving map, not signed and dated, but carved into the landscape by repeated human movement. A path becomes a trail becomes a route, a route becomes tradition. It's possible that some trade corridors are older than any one city, older than any one kingdom, because geography invites movement in the same places again and again. A careful reading might suggest that when later people talk about ancient ways and distant lands in mythic tones, they might be layering wonder onto very practical travel knowledge. You watch a worker roll a cylinder seal on wet clay to mark a cargo jar. The impression is crisp, a figure, a pattern, maybe a small scene. Most historians agree that seals were essential in trade and administration. Archaeology suggests seals functioned as signatures, security, and identity. The evidence we do have points to a world where trust is engineered through objects because you cannot personally supervise every jar as it travels. You need proof. You need marks. And the idea of marks travelling is quietly beautiful. A symbol pressed in clay here might be recognised by someone days away. Now you drift to the edge of the dock where a boat is being loaded. The hull smells of resin and river water. The bundles are tied with fibre rope. You hear the rhythm of labour lift, set, adjust, tie. The slow repetition is oddly soothing, like a lullaby built from effort. Archaeology suggests that boats and water transport were fundamental to Mesopotamian logistics. The evidence we do have points to canals connecting fields, cities, and trade points. And suddenly your theme feels more physical. If you want to imagine multiple civilizations, you need to imagine continuity, and trade is a form of continuity. It links people who do not share language. It links seasons, it links skills. It moves materials and ideas like a quiet bloodstream. Historians still argue whether certain legendary distant lands mentioned in Mesopotamian texts reflect actual geographic places, symbolic realms, or a blend of both. There's no full consensus because names travel and meanings shift. One interpretation is that stories of far-off lands capture real trade connections but exaggerate them for drama or prestige. Another interpretation is that they serve as mythic mirrors, places you can project your hopes and fears. Either way, the solid ground is that Mesopotamia was not alone. It was connected. Now comes your one quirky tidbit, clearly framed. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient descriptions of exotic materials and distant sources are evidence of contact with astonishingly advanced cultures, possibly even beyond the known ancient world. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an invitation to wonder about how ancient people experienced novelty. Imagine seeing lapis lazuli for the first time, a blue so deep it looks like a piece of night sky you can hold. Imagine hearing that it came from far away, over mountains, across deserts, through hands you will never meet. That alone is enough to make the world feel layered and strange. You walk along the edge of the market where imported goods are displayed. Stone beads, metal tools, timber pieces, fabrics. You see people touching items carefully, weighing them, evaluating. Most historians agree that material culture reveals trade and contact, and archaeology suggests that the distribution of certain materials can indicate long-distance exchange. The evidence we do have points to specialists and middlemen, to traders who understood risk and reward. In a sleep-friendly way, you consider the ancient version of shipping anxiety. A boat sinks, a caravan is delayed, a buyer complains, a scribe writes it down, because of course a scribe writes it down. Now for a light joke to keep you from drifting too far into heavy thinking. You imagine an ancient trader returning after weeks on the road, exhausted, sunburned and proud, only to hear someone say, "Great, but did you keep the receipt?" And the trader just stares into the middle distance, like they have seen the true face of civilization. Now you return to interpretation. One interpretation is that trade can create the illusion of sudden advancement because it brings concentrated novelty. A careful reading might suggest that when later texts talk about earlier ages that were more wondrous, they could be compressing centuries of incremental change into a single nostalgic picture. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it's a reasonable idea when you live after an era of flourishing trade. You might remember it as a golden age. When trade collapses, you might describe it as the world growing smaller, dimmer, less advanced. Historians still argue whether certain periods of Mesopotamian prosperity were primarily sustained by trade networks or by internal agricultural and administrative strength. There's no full consensus, and it is probably both, because cities thrive when they can feed themselves and also access materials they lack. The evidence we do have points to a balance of local productivity and external connections. So you hold the theme in a grounded way. On solid ground, trade networks show Mesopotamia's connectivity and the practical movement of goods. On misty ground, myths and rumours inflate distant lands into almost magical sources of knowledge, and in gentle imagination you picture routes that feel older than any one city, paths worn into the earth by generations, perhaps even by communities that lived and traded long before the texts you can read. You take a slow breath. The river laps, the boat creaks, the workers tie another bundle. The night deepens, and you walk away from the dock with the calming sense that civilization is not a single tower, but a web, and webs can survive even when one strand breaks. You drift toward the quieter rooftops as the city settles into evening, because the daytime clatter has softened into a steady hush, like someone laid a blanket over the streets. The air is cooler now. You smell smoke from cooking fires faintly sweet, and you hear a distant laugh that fades almost as soon as you notice it. Above you, the sky deepens from dusty blue into something darker and cleaner, and the first stars appear like tiny pinholes in a vast curtain. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians observed the night sky carefully. Archaeology suggests that sky watching fed calendars, omens, and agricultural timing, and the evidence we do have points to organised astronomical traditions developing over long periods. You climb a simple stairway to a flat roof and feel the warmth of sun-baked brick under your feet, still holding the day in its bones. Someone has placed a small oil lamp near the edge, and the flame flickers in a way that makes the shadows dance without drama. You sit, or at least you imagine yourself sitting, and you let your shoulders drop. The fan hum in your room becomes the night wind in this scene, and your breathing becomes the slow metronome of watching. What's broadly accepted is that keeping time mattered deeply in early cities. You need to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals, when to distribute rations, when to open canal gates. Archaeology suggests that calendars were tied to both practical and ritual needs, and the evidence we do have points to a world where the sky becomes the schedule. A careful reading might suggest that when people map the stars, they are also mapping their anxiety. If you can name a pattern in the sky, you can pretend the universe is orderly. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because sky law is not only anxiety, it's also beauty, curiosity, and tradition. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian astronomical practices should be viewed primarily as scientific observation, religious omen reading, or a blend that changes over time. There's no full consensus, and the blend is likely because humans rarely separate wonder from utility. You can watch the sky for poetry and still use it to count months. Now you look upward and feel the strange comfort of it. The same stars shine above you now in your own life, even if light pollution tries to stage a hostile takeover. The evidence we do have points to the fact that ancient people recognized patterns, tracked cycles, and developed ways to predict certain celestial events. Most historians agree that these traditions eventually influenced later astronomy in the region. And here is your mainstream anchor that feels like a soft handshake across time, the division of time and angles in ways connected to ancient Mesopotamian numerical systems echoes in how we still measure hours in circles. You sit with that and think, wow, even when you're trying to fall asleep, your clock is quietly haunted by ancient math. Now gently interpretation arrives. One interpretation is that starred lists and celestial catalogues preserve older layers because scribes copied and refined them across generations. A careful reading might suggest that certain names, groupings, or patterns might be remnants of earlier local traditions absorbed and standardized. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it fits what we know about scribal culture. Copying preserves and also edits, like a long game of telephone where the message is written down but still shaped by the hands that hold it. Historians still argue whether specific star catalogues reflect continuous observation over centuries or periodic compilation based on older records. There's no full consensus, and the uncertainty is part of the charm. It means the sky knowledge is both stable and alive, both inherited and renewed. Now you let the mist rise in the most sleep-friendly way. What if the night sky is the only thing that remembers all six, not as a literal record of lost civilizations, but as a steady backdrop that has watched people build, lose, rebuild, and look up again? A fringe idea proposes that advanced astronomical knowledge in ancient texts hints at inheritance from a much older, more advanced society. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a quiet, cinematic thought. What if some patterns were discovered, forgotten, and rediscovered each time, feeling like a secret from the past? You watch the stars for a while and your mind begins to notice how humans can turn dots into stories. A cluster becomes a hero. A line becomes an animal. A bright star becomes a sign. Most historians agree that omen literature and celestial interpretation were part of Mesopotamian intellectual life. Archaeology suggests that these practices were connected to court and temple settings. The evidence we do have points to a world where the sky is read like a text, and the people who can read it hold influence. Which is funny because even now, if someone confidently explains Mercury retrograde at a dinner party, a certain number of people will nod like, yes, yes, the cosmos is definitely responsible for my email backlog. Now here is your quirky tidbit clearly framed. A popular rumour claims that some ancient skywatchers tracked cycles so precisely they must have had lost instruments or secret observatories that were far more advanced than we imagine. This isn't widely accepted and it often stretches the evidence. But it does point to something real. Careful observation over long time spans can produce impressive results without fancy tools. If you watch the sky nightly record patterns and pass knowledge through trained scribes, you can build a sophisticated tradition. Sometimes the most advanced instrument is simply patience. Historians still argue whether the earliest phases of Mesopotamian skywatching were systematic enough to be called astronomy in the modern sense. There's no full consensus because modern categories don't always fit ancient practices. One interpretation is that the line between science and omen was not a line at all. It was a braid. The same observation could help you set a calendar and also give you a story about divine messages. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. You shift on the roof and feel the brick's warmth fade. The lamp flame wobbles. Somewhere below, a dog barks, once then decides the universe is not worth further comment. The city's sounds become softer, and you keep your focus on the sky because it is the calmest part of the scene. Now you let the theme of Six Before Us drift through this star-filled space with a grounded lens. On solid ground, you have a culture that observes and records celestial cycles, building calendars and traditions. On interpreted ground, you have copied lists that may preserve older layers of sky lore. And in gentle imagination, you have the feeling of repetition, people in different eras looking up and feeling the same small shock of wonder, as if they are not the first to ask what came before us. What if the older worlds are not separate planets or secret continents, but simply earlier human phases whose knowledge survives in fragments, a way of counting months, a name for a star, a ritual time to a season? Those fragments can feel like whispers from a prior chapter. Historians still argue whether ancient texts that speak of cosmic order and divine decisions reflect actual attempts to model the world or primarily serve religious and political needs. There's no full consensus, and the honest answer might be both. The evidence we do have points to humans doing what humans always do. They try to make sense of the unpredictable by mapping it. They try to turn change into pattern. You take a slow breath and let the stars become less like questions and more like background. The lamp flickers, the wind is gentle, the roof is warm enough to comfort you, and you carry one quiet thought with you as you drift onward. If civilizations rise and fall, the sky does not change its face for them. It simply continues patient and steady, offering the same cold beauty to every set of tired eyes that looks up from the mud and wonders what time really is. You climb down from the roof and follow a street that grows quieter as the city's lamps wink out one by one, like sleepy eyes deciding they've had enough of being responsible. The air cools further. Your footsteps sound softer now, cushioned by dust and the day's settling silence. Ahead, a dark mass rises against the starry sky, broad at the base, and stepped upward in slow tiers. You don't need anyone to tell you what it is. Your body already understands the feeling of a big structure meant to be seen. Most historians agree that ziggurats were monumental temple platforms in Mesopotamian cities. Archaeology suggests they served religious and civic symbolism, and the evidence we do have points to their role as the architectural heart of an urban landscape. You stand at the base and look up. The scale is not terrifying, but it is humbling, like standing near a cliff that isn't trying to hurt you but still remind you you're small. The bricks smell faintly of baked clay and bitumen. You can feel heat still lingering in the structure stored from the sun. A lamp somewhere casts a thin line of light along a stair. The steps are worn. People have climbed here for generations, carrying offerings, sweeping dust, whispering prayers, occasionally tripping, and pretending it never happened. What's broadly accepted is that these structures were built through organised labour and sustained institutional power. Archaeology suggests that ziggurats were not tombs and not secret bunkers but platforms that raised a temple closer to the sky in symbolic terms. The evidence we do have points to staged construction, maintenance and reconstruction over time. They are not the kind of building you make on a whim. They are a civic project, a declaration in brick that says we are here, we are organised, and we can move a lot of mud in the same direction. Now you climb a few steps and pause. The city spreads out behind you. You can smell smoke, damp earth, and a faint herbal scent from crushed plants underfoot. The night is calm. You hear a distant murmur from a late conversation, and then silence returns. A careful reading might suggest that the ziggurat is not only religious architecture, but also a public statement about order. It is a mountain in a flat land, an artificial centre. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated in terms of emphasis, not in terms of whether ziggurats existed. They did. But the meaning you assign can shift. For some it is devotion, for others it is politics. Often it is both. Historians still argue whether ziggurats should be interpreted primarily as cosmological models, political symbols, or pragmatic temple bases designed to keep sacred spaces above flood levels and street crime. There's no full consensus, and the truth may be a blend that varies by city and period. The evidence we do have points to multiple functions layered into one shape. You continue upward slowly, not racing because this is bedtime history, not cardio history. Your knees appreciate your commitment to calm. At a landing, you notice the geometry. The lines are simple, repeated, measured. The corners feel deliberate. You can imagine planners and builders using standardized measures, strings, and sightlines. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian builders had practical geometry and measurement skills. Archaeology suggests organized construction methods and planning. The evidence we do have points to the fact that monumental architecture requires math, logistics, and administration, which means it also requires record-keeping, labor management, and social coordination. Everything returns to systems. Now comes the misty temptation, and you handle it carefully. A popular rumour claims that ziggurats were not just symbolic mountains, but functional machines, observatories, or energy devices designed by an advanced civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it is thin. The mainstream view is that ziggurats were temple platforms with religious and civic roles. But if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful question about why geometry makes humans suspicious. When you see a big structure with precise lines, your brain wants it to have a secret purpose. Sometimes the secret purpose is simply show power, host ritual, impress neighbours, and make everyone feel small enough to cooperate. Still, you are allowed a quiet cinematic thought. What if their geometry quietly imitates a forgotten machine? Not because builders had a hidden blueprint from a lost world, but because humans repeat effective shapes. A stepped platform is stable. It distributes weight. It can be built with modular bricks. It elevates a sacred space. It creates processional drama. It is a practical solution that also feels symbolic. A careful reading might suggest that later people could look at such a structure and imagine older knowledge behind it, especially if they did not understand the engineering or the labour system that produced it. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated when it comes to how later interpretations form, not the bricks themselves. Historians still argue whether the strongest reason for the stepped form was symbolic imitation of a sacred mountain, practical concerns like stability and elevation, or the constraints of materials and construction methods. There's no full consensus, and the answer can vary. The evidence we do have points to local tradition and function working together. You reach a higher level and feel the wind more directly. It carries the smell of river water and distant fields. The city below seems smaller, quieter, almost toy-like, and you get that strange sensation that you are standing in two times at once. What's broadly accepted is that in the ancient world, monumental structures anchored communal identity. Archaeology suggests that temples and ziggurats were rebuilt and maintained across generations, meaning they were long-term projects that outlived individual rulers. The evidence we do have points to continuity in institutions and rituals, even as politics changed. Now you let interpretation do its gentle work. One interpretation is that these long-lived structures created the feeling of an eternal centre, a sense that the city was part of a larger cosmic order. A careful reading might suggest that texts describing gods dwelling on high places reflect the experience of climbing and looking out over the world, feeling the sky closer. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is emotionally plausible, and emotion is often the glue of belief. Now you meet your quirky tidbit in a calm way. A fringe idea proposes that some ziggurats were aligned with stars or celestial events with a precision that implies advanced astronomical planning. This theory isn't widely accepted in its strongest form, and it can overstate what we can demonstrate, but it gestures towards something real ancient builders did care about: orientation processions and symbolic alignment. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine planners choosing directions that felt meaningful even if the primary function remained ritual and civic. Historians still argue whether any specific alignments were intentional, symbolic, or simply practical responses to city layout and terrain. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty keeps your feet on the steps. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pause near the top and imagine the small temple that would have sat above a place for offerings, storage of sacred items and ritual performance. The lamplight would flicker here, the wind would tug at clothing, the city would be a grid of dim glow below. You can see why someone might say this is closer to heaven. It feels like it, even if heaven is just the sky and a good view. Now you let the theme of 6 before us pass through this architecture without turning it into a claim. On solid ground, ziggurats show advanced organisation in the sense of coordinated labour and planning. On interpreted ground, they can be read as symbols of cosmic order and institutional continuity. And in gentle imagination, you allow a thought: what if each rebuilding of such a structure is a kind of civilization restart, a new layer laid on an old foundation, making the building itself a literal stack of human chapters? You feel how sleep-friendly that idea is. Not a scary reset, but a slow layering, brick upon brick, season upon season, generation upon generation. And you realise the most mysterious part might not be hidden machines. It might be the quiet endurance of cooperation, the fact that humans can gather, agree labour, and preserve a shared centre for centuries. Historians still argue whether we should view these monuments primarily through the lens of religion, state power, or community identity, and there's no full consensus because all three are present. You take a slow breath at the height, feel the wind, and then begin to descend, carrying with you the steady rhythm of steps, the smell of clay, and the calm understanding that sometimes the grandest mystery is not what was built, but how it was kept standing. You step off the last stair and let your feet find the flatter streets again, and the city feels more intimate now, like you've come down from a big thought into smaller ones. The air holds a sleepy sweetness, smoke and bread and damp earth. A dog pads past you with the quiet confidence of someone who owns the night shift. Somewhere a door closes softly. The world is winding down, but stories are waking up because this is the hour when people stop moving long enough to remember. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes epics, myths, hymns and tales that reflect values, social norms, and glimpses of real places. Archaeology suggests these texts were copied and preserved by scribes, and the evidence we do have points to a rich storytelling tradition that became part of cultural memory. You follow a narrow lane and hear voices drifting from an interior courtyard. The sound is low and calm, like a family talking before sleep. You pause outside the read screen and let the words wash over you, even if you can't catch every detail. A story is being told. It has rhythm. It has pauses. It has a familiar human shape, where someone is brave, someone is foolish, someone learns the hard way, and everyone listening thinks that would never be me, except it absolutely would be me. What's broadly accepted is that stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh contain mythic elements alongside references to real cities and realistic human emotions. The evidence we do have points to the fact that these tales were not mere entertainment. They were also lessons, reflections, and ways of making sense of life. Now you step onto the truth ladder, starting with solid ground. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian epics preserve cultural values, including ideas about kingship, friendship, mortality, and the limits of human control. Archaeology suggests that the names of cities in these stories often correspond to real locations that were important in ancient Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have points to a blended world where myth and reality sit at the same table and share the same bowl of stew. Then you rise into interpretation. One interpretation is that monsters and supernatural trials in these stories can encode real fears, wild landscapes, disease, political chaos, or the uncertainty of nature. A careful reading might suggest that when a hero faces a creature in a cedar forest, the story may be dramatizing the risks of travel resource extraction or confrontation with the unknown. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because sometimes a monster is just a monster, and storytellers are allowed to have fun. Historians still argue whether mythic motifs in Mesopotamian literature should be read as symbolic allegory, echoes of real events, or primarily as religious narrative. There's no full consensus, and that keeps you from clenching too tightly. You are not here to squeeze a story until it confesses. You are here to listen. You move past the courtyard and notice a small clay figurine on a ledge shaped like an animal with exaggerated features. It looks slightly comical, like a creature caught mid-surprise. You smile, because even in ancient times, people liked little objects with personality. Archaeology suggests that figurines and amulets were used for household religion and protection. The evidence we do have points to a world where the boundary between daily life and the unseen was porous. People asked for safety. People feared sickness. People wanted blessings. In a way, it's the same as now, except the modern version is turning off your phone and hoping tomorrow's emails are kinder. Now you meet your quirky tidbit in a safe frame. A popular rumour claims that certain Mesopotamian myths are disguised reports of high technology or non-human visitors with monsters standing in for machines, and gods standing in for advanced beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on very stretched interpretations. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it tends to be thin. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still offers a useful question. Why do humans keep rereading old stories, through the lens of whatever they fear or admire in their own era. A careful reading might suggest that myths are flexible containers. In one era, they explain storms as divine moods. In another, they become psychology. In another, they become science fiction. None of that necessarily tells you what the original storyteller intended. It mostly tells you what the listener wants. Historians still argue whether flood passages in epics like Gilgamesh reflect historical memory of real inundations or are literary borrowings shaped for thematic impact. There's no full consensus, and the evidence we do have points to a long tradition of storytelling motifs that can travel between texts. This is a gentle reminder that myths can be ancient even within the ancient world. A story can already have a long history by the time it's written down. You walk through a darker street where the smell changes, more damp, more cool, as if the city itself is exhaling. You hear someone quietly strumming or tapping a rhythm on a pot, and the sound is soft and repetitive. It makes you think of how stories and music both work, pattern and variation, familiarity and surprise. Most historians agree that performance and oral tradition likely played a major role in how stories circulated. Archaeology suggests that writing preserved some versions, but did not replace spoken storytelling in daily life. The evidence we do have points to a culture where words travelled by voice long before they travelled by clay. Now in interpretation mode, you consider how myth might interact with the idea of worlds before ours. One interpretation is that tales of earlier ages, heroes, and divine decisions are ways of conceptualizing deep time. A careful reading might suggest that when texts speak of a time when gods walked closer to humans, or when kings were different, they could be marking a perceived gap between present life and an idealized past. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it fits a common human habit. We imagine the past as larger than life because the present feels too ordinary. And the present, if you're honest, is always too ordinary. Even ancient people probably looked around at their daily chores and thought surely the ancestors had better lighting and fewer taxes. Then they invented a golden age to cope. Now the gentle imagination enters with a soft question. What if the strangest creatures are just history wearing a costume? What if a monster is the fear of the unknown, river been the terror of a disease, the shock of a drought, the experience of encountering a foreign army, or the bewilderment of watching a city collapse? That is not a claim. It's a bedtime possibility, the kind that lets you enjoy the story without insisting the monster must be literal or must be a spaceship. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Historians still argue whether the purpose of these myths was primarily moral instruction, entertainment, ritual reinforcement, or political legitimation. There's no full consensus because a story can do all of those at once, depending on who tells it and why. A king hears legitimacy, a priest hears theology, a tired worker hears a tale that makes the night feel less heavy. You pass a small workshop where a lamp still burns, someone is smoothing clay, shaping a small plaque. The gesture is slow, careful. You see that even art here is made from the same earth as everything else, clay becomes a bowl, clay becomes a tablet, clay becomes a figurine, clay becomes the vessel that carries fear, hope and memory, and that brings you back to your central theme without re-explaining it, because you can feel it now. The idea of multiple civilizations before ours might be less about literal numbered empires and more about layers of human experience preserved in story form. Each era tells the next: we lived, we struggled, we learned, we lost, we rebuilt. Now for a light joke to keep your mind from turning too serious. You imagine Gilgamesh listening to a scribe read his story and saying, "That's not exactly how it happened." And the scribe replies, "It's the director's cut." Even in ancient times, somebody was probably mad about how they were portrayed. You slow your pace and listen again to distant voices. The story in the courtyard is reaching a quiet moment. The listeners are still. The night holds them gently. And you let yourself accept a calm conclusion for this section. Myths are not instruction manuals for hidden technology, and they are not simple lies either. They are human tools for making meaning. They can preserve memories of real places and real challenges. They can exaggerate. They can symbolize. They can comfort. Historians still argue whether we can ever fully separate historical kernels from literary invention in these ancient texts. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. You don't need certainty to feel the warmth of the firelight and the softness of the night. You just need the sense that humans have always told stories to survive the dark, and sometimes the darkest thing is not a monster, but the quiet knowledge that time keeps moving. Whether a civilization calls itself first, seventh, or something it never bothered to count. You walk beyond the tighter streets into a stretch of ground where the city's edges blur into fields and canals, and the night feels wider, quieter, more honest. The air smells like damp soil and crushed grasses, and somewhere a frog decides to contribute one single note to the orchestra, then goes silent as if it regrets oversharing. You follow a narrow canal path where water slides along slowly, and you notice how the landscape looks calm, but also how easily calm can change. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian societies faced repeating environmental stresses, including drought, shifting river channels, and salinization of soils. Archaeology suggests that agricultural productivity could rise and fall with water management and climate patterns, and the evidence we do have points to a long history of adaptation, not one smooth upward climb. You stop near a field boundary marked by a low ridge. In the moonlight, it's just a line of earth, but it represents something important: ownership, labour, survival, and the fragile agreement that this patch is yours and that patch is mine. What's broadly accepted is that large irrigation systems require cooperation and constant maintenance. Archaeology suggests that canal networks can expand silt up, be repaired, be rerouted, and sometimes be abandoned. The evidence we do have points to the fact that when a canal fails, it is not merely water that disappears. It is the schedule of planting, the distribution of grain, the ability to pay workers, the stability of families. The whole city feels it like a body, noticing a slow cramp in its side. Now you climb one rung into interpretation gently. One interpretation is that ancient stories about ages and worlds can reflect the lived experience of disruption. A careful reading might suggest that when people talk about the world changing, they might mean that the rules of survival have shifted, that the rhythms of water and harvest no longer match what their parents taught them. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is a human instinct to frame long hardship as a turning of the page because it makes suffering feel like part of a story instead of a random cruelty. You keep walking, and the canal path leads you past an older mound rising out of the plain like a sleeping animal. It is quite dark and slightly eerie in the most calm way, like a museum after hours. Archaeology suggests that many ancient sites form Tell's mounds, created by centuries of building collapse and rebuilding in the same spot. The evidence we do have points to literal layering walls, floors on floors, ash layers, flood silts, new bricks laid atop old bricks. If you want a physical image of civilization as a series of chapters, it is right here in the ground, waiting under your feet. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian history includes periods of political fragmentation and reconsolidation with city-states rising, competing, forming alliances, and sometimes falling under larger regional powers. Archaeology suggests that shifts in trade routes and resource access could influence which cities prospered. The evidence we do have points to a pattern that looks less like a straight road and more like a river branching, shifting occasionally, cutting a new channel. And if you listen closely, the landscape tells you the same thing. The tablets imply in their own way continuity is real, but it is rarely smooth. Historians still argue whether episodes of collapse in ancient Mesopotamia were driven more by environmental stress, internal political conflict, or changes in regional trade and migration patterns. There's no full consensus, and that is not a weakness. It is a realistic reflection of how complex systems behave. Multiple pressures can pile up until something gives, and the something might be a dynasty, a canal network, or a trade relationship that kept resources flowing. You pause and look at the canal water again. It looks calm, but you remember how it can turn salty over time if irrigation water evaporates and leaves minerals behind. What's broadly accepted is that soil salinization became a serious issue in parts of southern Mesopotamia over long periods, affecting crop yields and agricultural choices. Archaeology suggests that shifts from wheat to more salt-tolerant barley occurred in some contexts. The evidence we do have points to a quiet kind of catastrophe, not dramatic like a storm, but slow like a cough that doesn't go away. You imagine farmers noticing that the ground tastes different, that the harvest is weaker, that the familiar routines are failing, and you realize how easy it is for a society to feel like it is entering a new age without any trumpet announcing it. Now comes the misty space, carefully handled. A fringe idea proposes that abrupt declines in certain places reflect sudden civilization resets that wiped out advanced knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The mainstream view is that environmental stress, political instability, and shifting economic networks can explain many downturns without invoking a complete amnesia event. But if we treat the reset idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still help you think about how fragile certain skills are. A city can lose specialists, a school can stop teaching, a workshop can close. Knowledge can shrink even when humans remain. You keep walking and you notice a small cluster of lights in the distance, a hamlet or farmstead. The glow is gentle. The idea lands softly when big centres weaken smaller communities can persist carrying practical techniques forward. The evidence we do have points to continuity in everyday life, even when political banners change. One interpretation is that what later ages call collapse can sometimes be a reorganisation, a shifting of population and power rather than a total disappearance. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because the lived experience of collapse can be very real for those inside it, even if some continuity remains. Now for a light joke to keep your sleepy brain from getting too serious. You imagine an ancient official trying to file a report about declining yields and writing due to unforeseen circumstances. Then you imagine the river replying. The circumstances were extremely foreseeable. You just ignored me. Rivers have that passive-aggressive energy when you build canals without maintenance. You stop near a broken reed fence and listen. The night is calm. The wind makes a soft hiss through grasses like the world whispering, slow down. You let your thoughts settle on the idea of advanced technology because it's easy to misframe it. In mainstream terms, the most advanced technology in early urban societies is often institutional coordinated labour, standardized measures, record keeping, storage and maintenance. Archaeology suggests that when institutions weaken, these systems can degrade and life can become more local, more improvised. The evidence we do have points to the idea that progress is not a permanent trophy. It is a habit, and habits can be broken. Now comes your quirky tidbit framed safely. A popular rumour claims that somewhere out there missing tablets once described astonishing devices or forgotten sciences, and that their loss explains gaps in our understanding of the past. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it tends to over-dramatise what most tablets actually contain, which is often extremely practical. But it points at a real truth: the survival of evidence is uneven. Some things were never written down, some tablets cracked, some were reused, some were lost. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You smile again, because if you want a truly ancient constant, it is the human desire to imagine the missing piece is the most exciting piece. People do it now. If a folder is labelled miscellaneous, you assume it contains secrets. It usually contains old receipts and a random battery that might be dead. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but you know it in your bones. Now you shift into gentle imagination, keeping it clearly in the realm of mood. What if resilience is the true advanced technology? What if the 6 before us is not a lineup of glittering super civilizations, but a poetic way of saying humanity has restarted itself many times, learning to rebuild from disruption? The evidence we do have points to repeated adaptation, changing crops, rerouting canals, reorganizing labour, shifting political centres, preserving stories. And even if we cannot count those restarts neatly as 6, it's possible that ancient people felt them as separate phases, each one different enough to feel like a new world. You take a slow breath and the night air feels cool in your lungs. Another light joke floats in, gentle as a feather. You imagine a scribe trying to keep records during a crisis and thinking, I chose the wrong career. Then you remember there were probably no career counsellors, just someone handing you a stylus and saying, congratulations, you are now responsible for everyone's barley. You look at the mound again and think about how it holds layers without telling you the whole story. Archaeology suggests layers can show rebuilding after damage, but interpreting exactly what each layer means can be complicated. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and that is where you let your mind rest. You don't need a single dramatic apocalypse. You can accept the quiet truth that civilizations can thin out, redirect and reform, sometimes slowly, sometimes sharply under pressures that stack up like bricks. And as you walk back along the canal path, you carry a calm, grounded understanding. The past is full of rhythms, growth and strain, cooperation and conflict, abundance and scarcity. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If you treat the 7th civilization idea as a bedtime lens, rather than a claim, it becomes something soothing. It becomes a reminder that humans have been here before, facing changing water and shifting rules, and they kept going one repaired canal gate at a time. You drift back toward the city, but you don't go straight into the brightest streets. You choose the quieter lanes where the walls hold the day's warmth like a memory, and the night air slips through narrow passages in a cool, steady stream. The fan hum in your room blends with the imagined sound of distant water. Your footsteps are slow, unhurried, the kind that tells your mind it can stop gripping the day. Most historians agree that the idea of multiple, fully advanced prehistoric civilizations is debated and not part of mainstream archaeological consensus. Archaeology suggests that complex societies emerged in different regions over long timescales, and the evidence we do have points to many stages of development rather than a neat numbered sequence. And yet the phrase that brought you here tonight is stubbornly poetic. We are the 7th civilization. Sumerian records show 6 advanced societies before ours. You hold it gently like a smooth stone you found in a riverbed, not as a certificate of truth, but as a lens. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian texts sometimes speak of deep past eras, and that they blend mythic time with historical memory. One interpretation is that those eras can be read as symbolic phases rather than literal global civilizations, and in calm imagination you allow the possibility that 6 before ours functions like a bedtime metaphor for repeating human cycles a way of saying people have built and rebuilt more times than we can neatly count. Historians still argue whether the numbers and eras in texts like king lists and myths were meant as chronological claims or as literary and political structures that organise the past. There's no full consensus, and that is exactly why this section exists, because you are now doing the most important work of a curious mind, separating what can be supported from what merely feels compelling. You pause by a small courtyard where a water jar sits under a reed awning. The jar is chipped but still useful. That feels like a metaphor too, and you let it be one. The evidence we do have points to the reality that ancient texts are incomplete, copied, edited, and sometimes damaged. Archaeology suggests that interpretation is always required because the past does not arrive in your hands with a label that says, "This is 100% literal." Most historians agree that historians themselves argue, disagree, and revise, which is not a scandal. It's the job. Now you take the truth ladder and set it down in front of you like a calm set of steps. Documented widely accepted history and archaeology, interpreted reasonable readings of texts and patterns signposted as interpretation, imagined cinematic what-if clearly framed as possibility. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On the documented rung, you can say that early Mesopotamian societies produced texts that describe kingship floods, divine order, and the origins of cities. You can say that these societies built temples, managed irrigation, traded widely, and developed writing and mathematics. Archaeology suggests that these developments happened over centuries and millennia with regional variation and periods of stress. The evidence we do have points to continuity and change, not a simple clean restart. That is solid ground. On the interpreted rung, you can say that mythic language about before and after can reflect how people experienced disruption. One interpretation is that flood narratives exaggerated rains and tales of earlier ages express a cultural memory of instability and rebuilding. A careful reading might suggest that numbers like 6 could be symbolic, used to structure time and meaning rather than count literal empires. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is a plausible interpretive move because ancient literature often uses numbers for order, rhythm, and emphasis. Historians still argue whether certain numerical patterns in ancient texts reflect symbolic convention, scribal tradition, or attempts at literal chronology. There's no full consensus, and you don't need one tonight to enjoy the question safely. Now you step into the misty rung and you do it with careful shoes on. A fringe idea proposes that the 6 before us refers to 6 advanced societies that rose and fell globally, leaving behind hidden ruins, lost technologies, and secret knowledge later picked up by Sumer. This theory isn't widely accepted. The evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Mainstream archaeology does not support a clean sequence of 6 globally advanced civilizations hidden entirely from the record. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still explore why the idea persists and what kind of clues people point to. People point to big gaps in evidence, to missing tablets, to the dramatic nature of flood myths, to the grandeur of monuments, to the sophistication of math. They point to the feeling that progress sometimes looks sudden, and then they connect those points into a storyline. The human mind loves storyline. It does not like messy timelines. It does not like maybe. It does not like it depends. It wants a neat list. It wants a number. It wants to say, here was 6, now here is 7, and the rest is destiny. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That desire for neatness is understandable, but it can also trick you into treating metaphor as inventory. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a very common pattern. You see it everywhere. People see a map and think it has to lead to treasure. Sometimes it leads to a coffee shop, which is still treasure, just caffeinated. Historians still argue whether modern lost civilization narratives are driven more by genuine interpretive curiosity or by selective reading and the allure of dramatic simplicity. There's no full consensus, but it is fair to say the topic sits at the crossroads of evidence and imagination. Now you sit with a calmer, safer way to hold the 6 before us idea. One interpretation is that it can be a metaphor for layers of human experience, not necessarily 6 specific empires. Another interpretation is that it can reflect how ancient scribes organized mythical deep time, dividing eras to express moral or cosmic shifts. A more cautious explanation could be that if 6 appears in a modern framing, it may be less about what Sumerian texts explicitly state, and more about how modern audiences summarize the mood of those texts. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because texts can be read in many ways, and modern retellings often simplify. Now for your quirky tidbit, safely framed. A popular rumour claims that there are forbidden caches of tablets that would rewrite everything about early history, and that scholars are hiding them. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it tends to ignore the messy practical realities of archaeology preservation and academic disagreement. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still lead to a gentler truth. Many discoveries are incomplete. Many sites are unexcavated, and many artifacts do sit in collections waiting for study. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You breathe slowly and let that line settle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That sentence doesn't feed panic. It feeds patience. It invites you to relax into uncertainty without treating it as an enemy. Now you return to your main theme with the kind of honesty that keeps a channel safe and sleep-friendly. Most historians agree that our current civilization builds on countless prior societies across the world, not just one lineage. Archaeology suggests that innovations appear spread and sometimes disappear, leaving uneven traces. The evidence we do have points to a vast, tangled heritage of human experimentation. If you insist on a number, you'll always be disappointed, because history is not a neat staircase. It is a field full of overlapping footprints. Historians still argue whether it is even meaningful to label human development as civilizations in a single linear sequence, since different regions develop complex societies at different times. There's no full consensus, and that debate itself is a clue the past resists being forced into one tidy story. So you hold the idea of being the seventh in a softer way, as a metaphor for humility, as a reminder that you stand on layers, as a bedtime lens. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And in that gentle imagination, you allow one last calm thought to float upward like a lantern. What if 6 before us is not a count of lost empires, but a warning wrapped in poetry that humans have built worlds, lost worlds, and rebuilt worlds many times, and the only truly advanced thing is learning to build with care? You drift through a corridor of dim light where the city's late-night life thins into soft pockets of silence. A single lamp glows behind a reed screen. A cat slips along a wall like it has appointments you will never understand. The air smells faintly of cooled ash and warm clay. You feel the soothing pull of mystery, because mystery is like a blanket when it's handled gently, and you also feel the responsibility to keep your feet on the ground. Most historians agree that modern fascination with lost civilizations often grows faster than the evidence. Archaeology suggests that much of what we know is shaped by what survives and what gets studied, and the evidence we do have points to real gaps and uncertainties without requiring a single hidden master narrative. You stop in a small open courtyard where someone has left a basket of reeds and a coil of rope. The objects look ordinary, and that's perfect because ordinary objects are where truth likes to hide. What's broadly accepted is that most ancient records we have are incomplete, scattered and preserved unevenly. Archaeology suggests that many tablets were broken, recycled or lost, and the evidence we do have points to vast portions of ancient life that were never written down at all. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, the thinness is not a failure. It is simply the shape of what survived. Now you step into interpretation gently. One interpretation is that the very incompleteness of the record encourages dramatic storytelling. A careful reading might suggest that when people encounter a gap, they instinctively fill it with the most exciting possibility. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because sometimes a gap really is meaningful and sometimes it's just missing paper, missing clay, missing time. But it is human nature to dislike blank spaces. A blank space feels like an invitation. Historians still argue whether the public's most popular theories about missing history reflect genuine interpretive creativity or a tendency to over-explain uncertainty. There's no full consensus, but the pattern is familiar. A missing page becomes a conspiracy. A broken tablet becomes a secret. A ruined wall becomes proof of something dramatic. Sometimes it's just a broken tablet and a ruined wall, which is honestly still dramatic if you think about how long it took to get ruined. Now comes your quirky tidbit, framed safely and calmly. A popular rumour claims that there are archives of hidden tablets that would overturn mainstream history overnight, and that they are kept from view. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often simplifies how scholarship actually works. The evidence we do have points to a more ordinary reality. Collections exist. Cataloguing takes time. Translation is difficult and scholarly. Disagreement is normal. If we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the useful takeaway is softer. There may be texts not yet fully studied, but that is not the same thing as a single locked chest labelled Secrets of the Six Civilizations. You let that image go with a gentle smile because it's a little funny. Humans love a locked chest story. It's emotionally satisfying. It turns the messy work of slow interpretation into a treasure hunt. And as much as your sleepy brain might enjoy that, you also know a calmer truth. The real treasure hunt in ancient history is patience. You walk past a doorway where someone is quietly polishing a seal stone, the motion small, repetitive, soothing. What's broadly accepted is that seal stones and inscriptions are important sources for understanding administration and identity. Archaeology suggests that small artifacts can reveal networks of trade office and social status, and the evidence we do have points to incremental learning, tiny discoveries that shift big pictures slowly, not overnight. Now you meet the fringe ideas more directly, but you keep your voice gentle. A fringe idea proposes that maps and myths preserve the locations of advanced pre-Sumerian ruins waiting to be found. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence is often indirect. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic mood. Imagine an explorer following an old name from a tablet, walking across the plain and finding a mound that looks ordinary until it starts yielding brick seals and forgotten rooms. Not a glowing city of machines, but a quiet earlier settlement that makes the timeline feel deeper. Historians still argue whether legendary place names in Mesopotamian texts correspond to specific identifiable sites, or whether they function as symbolic geography. There's no full consensus, and that keeps your imagination flexible without turning it reckless. The evidence we do have points to both some names map to real places, others may be mythic or shifting labels. Now you bring in the forbidden archives vibe in a safer way. A fringe idea proposes that certain knowledge was intentionally restricted to elites, and that some traditions were guarded within temple or palace circles. This isn't widely accepted as a single dramatic cover-up, but it has a reasonable kernel. Literacy itself was limited, and institutions controlled records. A careful reading might suggest that what feels like hidden knowledge can sometimes be simply specialized knowledge available only to trained scribes. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because access varies across time and place, and not everything restricted is secret in a conspiratorial sense. Sometimes it's just hard. You pause near a low wall and listen to the quiet. The city feels like it is breathing in slow cycles. You can almost hear the distant scratch of a stylus somewhere, still working, still recording. You think about how modern theories often search for a single dramatic hinge, the one missing tablet that proves everything. But the evidence we do have points to something less cinematic and more real: history changes by accumulation. Now for a light joke to keep your mind from getting too intense. You imagine an ancient scribe looking at a rumour spreading through the city and writing a tablet titled, "Please stop saying the temple has a secret laser." Then you realise, even if a scribe wrote that, it would be the one tablet that didn't survive, because irony is also ancient. Now you return to interpretation. One interpretation is that the 6 civilizations idea thrives because it offers a simple frame for a complex reality, cycles of rise and fall, layers of settlement, and repeated adaptation. A careful reading might suggest that when modern audiences say 6 advanced societies, they may be translating ancient ages into modern vocabulary. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is a common transformation. People turn poetic time into numeric time. They turn mythic distance into engineering distance. They turn symbolic language into literal claims. Historians still argue whether it is valid to apply modern categories like advanced technology to ancient myths and lists, since those texts serve different purposes than modern reports. There's no full consensus, and you can feel why. The more you try to press myth into the shape of a lab report, the more it wriggles out of your hands like wet clay. Now you let the mystery be mystery without misleading. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the missing time feeling is not hiding a secret empire, but highlighting how much human experience never gets recorded? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You say that again in your mind because it's soothing. It's permission to stop chasing certainty like it's a runaway goat. You walk past a small shrine where someone has left a simple offering. The gesture is small, but it is connected to a big human desire: continuity. To be remembered, to be protected, to have tomorrow make sense. Most historians agree that ritual practices helped communities create stability and shared meaning. Archaeology suggests that household and temple rituals were woven into daily life, and the evidence we do have points to traditions that persist even when politics shifts. Now the gentle imagination, carefully framed, opens like a quiet door. What if the real advanced thing in earlier societies was not gadgets, but continuity of practice? How to farm, how to store, how to count, how to build, how to tell stories that bind a community. Those are the skills that could survive disruptions, travel across regions, and re-emerge in new centres. And if you squint at history through that lens, you can see why a listener might say we are the 7th. Not because there were literally 6 identical global empires, but because humans have repeated the act of world building again and again. Historians still argue whether the strongest evidence for cultural continuity lies in texts, artifacts, settlement patterns, or environmental data. There's no full consensus because each category reveals different truths. The evidence we do have points to a past that is both knowable and incomplete, both grounded and misty. You take a slow breath and let your shoulders soften. The lamp light in the courtyard flickers. The city quiets further, and you carry forward a calm, safe conclusion for this section. You can enjoy rumours without believing them. You can explore fringe ideas without turning them into certainty. You can be curious without getting lost. And the best way to honour the ancient world is to let it be complicated, layered, and sometimes unresolved, like a story told in the dark, where not every detail is supposed to be sharp. You keep walking, and the city feels like it has slipped into a deeper sleep stage, the kind where the streets are still, but the walls seem to remember every footstep they held earlier. The air is cooler now, and the smell is simpler clay night, faint smoke, and the clean wet scent of water somewhere nearby. You find yourself in a place that feels like a crossroads, not of roads but of ideas. This is the spot where you decide how to carry mystery without letting it carry you. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian history is best understood through a combination of texts, archaeology, and environmental evidence, and that each source type has limits. Archaeology suggests slow cultural development with innovations accumulating over centuries, and the evidence we do have points to complexity rather than a single dramatic hidden timeline. You pause beside a low pile of bricks, perhaps remnants of a wall being repaired, and you watch a worker smoothing fresh clay onto the surface, like they're icing a cake that nobody will compliment until it's been standing for 200 years. You smile because the past is full of unsung labour. What's broadly accepted is that most social and technological change in ancient societies is incremental, built by many hands across generations. The evidence we do have points to the steady layering of knowledge, irrigation practices, refined administrative systems, expanded writing, standardized craft skills, honed trade links, strengthened. Now you step into interpretation with the gentleness of someone walking across a room where a baby is sleeping. One interpretation is that bursts of progress can look like inheritance. A careful reading might suggest that when you see a city suddenly producing lots of writing, lots of administrative order, lots of monumental construction, it can feel as if the people found a pre-made toolkit. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because historians and archaeologists often emphasize the long preconditions behind those bursts. Still, from inside the lived experience, a burst can feel sudden. Your grandparents might have farmed in small settlements, and you might live in a city with temple accounts, canal inspectors, and a calendar tied to the stars. Historians still argue whether certain apparent leaps in Mesopotamian complexity reflect genuine rapid transformation, or simply reflect the fact that the evidence becomes more visible in some periods than others. There's no full consensus, and that's an important point. Sometimes it is not that society changed overnight. It is that our window into it becomes clearer because more durable materials were produced, or more texts were preserved, or more sites were excavated. Now you take the truth ladder and use it like a calm sorting tray. Documented temples, canals, cities, writing trade, astronomy, myth. Interpreted eras and numbers as symbolic ways of organizing memory, stories as reflections of disruption, imagined 6 prior worlds as cinematic possibility, not confirmed fact. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and when it comes to claims of 6 fully advanced global civilizations before ours, the evidence is thin. Still, you can learn something useful from the idea without treating it as literal. A more cautious explanation could be that 6 before us works as a poetic reminder that human societies are layered and that many complex cultures precede us across the world. It's possible that the number is symbolic rather than historical accounting. To be clear, this is debated, and the point tonight is not to declare a verdict. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You walk into a small scribal room where a few tablets are stacked in neat piles. The room smells of damp clay and straw. The quiet is so thick it feels like a blanket. Most historians agree that writing preserved administrative and literary traditions, but that it did not capture everything. Archaeology suggests that the majority of ancient life remains invisible to us, especially the lives of ordinary people. The evidence we do have points to an uneven record. Lots of lists, fewer personal feelings, and only glimpses of daily voices. Now comes your quirky tidbit, framed safely. A popular rumour claims that ancient people intentionally encoded scientific knowledge inside myth to protect it from collapse, like a secret backup drive hidden in poetry. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often goes beyond what evidence can support. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can lead you to a gentler insight. Myths do preserve knowledge, just not usually in the form of engineering diagrams. They preserve social values, moral lessons, environmental awareness, and the emotional truth of vulnerability. Historians still argue whether mythic narratives should be used as evidence for specific historical events or treated primarily as cultural expression. There's no full consensus, and the best approach is often cautious. Recognize that myths can reflect lived realities without being literal records. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. You step back outside and the night has deepened further. The stars are brighter now. The street is quiet enough that you can hear your own sandals scuff dust, a soft whisper with each step. You pass a canal gate where a wooden beam rests against a frame, and you think about how much of civilization depends on small things staying intact. A gate, a rope, a seal, a list, a trained mind. Archaeology suggests that systems are fragile because they rely on maintenance. Most historians agree that institutional complexity can unravel when stresses pile up even without a single dramatic collapse. Now, you let the mystery come in without misleading. What if you can enjoy the cinematic question without turning it into certainty? What if the 6 civilizations idea is best treated as a narrative device that helps you feel the depth of time rather than a factual count? That doesn't kill the wonder. It actually makes the wonder safer because it can coexist with evidence. Historians still argue whether popular alternative narratives about ancient history can coexist with mainstream scholarship without distorting public understanding. There's no full consensus, but a careful approach can help. You can keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You can say this part is documented, this part is interpretation, this part is gentle imagination. and you can enjoy all three without mixing them into a single claim. Now you take a moment to do something sleep-friendly and honest. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When we talk about advanced, we should be clear what we mean. On solid ground, Mesopotamia shows advanced organization writing, administration, large-scale construction, trade networks, calendars, legal traditions. That is real, documented, and impressive. On the misty side, modern stories sometimes inflate advanced into modern tech-hidden machines, or global empires erased from the record. That is possible only as speculation, and the evidence is thin. You breathe slowly. The fan hum continues. The city in your imagination is quieter than ever, as if it too is ready to sleep. And you carry forward a calm synthesis. It's possible that bursts of progress felt like inheritance. It's possible that myths preserve layered memory. It's possible that numbers like 6 are symbolic. And it's also possible that the simplest explanation is often the strongest. Humans build, learn and pass knowledge forward in uneven ways, sometimes losing and regaining skills as conditions change. Historians still argue whether the best way to describe human history is as linear progress repeating cycles or overlapping regional stories. There's no full consensus, and that's comforting because it means you don't have to force the past into one shape to appreciate it. The evidence we do have points to many rhythms at once. A slow climb here, a sudden fall there, a quiet continuity in the background almost everywhere. You step toward the edge of the city where the fields begin again, and you notice how the horizon looks soft in the moonlight, as if the world itself is blurred just enough to invite rest. You let your thoughts soften too. You have sorted your clues, you have kept your footing, and you have learned how to hold a mystery without needing it to be a verdict. You walk until the streets thin into quiet again, where the city's edges breathe into open land, and the night feels wide enough to hold every question without answering any of them too sharply. The air is cool and steady, and the smell is mostly earth now, with a faint hint of smoke that lingers like the last word of a conversation. You hear water moving somewhere out in the dark, not loud, just persistent, as if it's doing its job, with zero interest in applause. Most historians agree that our current world is built on layers of earlier societies across many regions, not a single line of inheritance. Archaeology suggests that human history is a tapestry of different cultures rising, interacting, transforming, and sometimes fading, and the evidence we do have points to continuity in human habits, even when the names of cities and kings change. So when you hold the phrase, "we are the seventh civilization," you hold it softly now, not as a math problem, not as a locked door, but as a poetic way to measure humility. One interpretation is that seventh is less a census and more a reminder whatever we build today sits atop deep time. A careful reading might suggest that ancient texts describe multiple worlds, mainly as mythic eras that help people explain disruption and renewal. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is a safe place to rest your mind because it lets the mystery be meaningful without demanding that it become literal. Historians still argue whether the deep past eras described in Mesopotamian tradition should be read as symbolic phases, political storytelling, or echoes of real disruptions remembered through myth. There's no full consensus, and you can feel how that uncertainty becomes gentle rather than irritating. It means you can stop gripping, you can simply notice. You walk beside a low canal where the water reflects a strip of starlight, and you think about what a civilization actually is when you strip away the drama. On solid ground, it is people coordinating, sharing water, building walls, making rules, distributing food, teaching skills, keeping records, telling stories, measuring seasons. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamia developed many of these features early in urban history, and the evidence we do have points to a society that was deeply innovative in practical ways. That is documented. That is real. That is impressive. Now you allow interpretation to add one more quiet layer. One interpretation is that people in every era sense they are living after something because they can see ruins, hear old stories, inherit customs they didn't invent. A careful reading might suggest that the feeling of six before us could come from that constant human experience of layered memory. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated because you cannot neatly match feeling to a numbered list. But you can acknowledge that the feeling is real and that ancient people likely felt it too. Now for your quirky tidbit framed safely. A popular rumour claims that if we could recover every lost tablet and excavate every mound, we would find proof of a tidy sequence of multiple advanced worlds. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it tends to underestimate how messy human development is. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can lead to a calmer truth. The record will always be incomplete, and history will always be interpreted. Even if you had more tablets, you would still have debates because meaning is not stored in clay alone. It's created in the space between the marks and the reader. Historians still argue whether the biggest gaps in our understanding come from lost evidence, limited excavation, or the difficulty of interpreting what survives. There's no full consensus, and that is a quiet reminder that uncertainty is not a crack in the story. It is part of the story. You keep walking, and the night feels softer, as if the world is lowering its voice with you. The sky is wide and calm. The stars look steady, and the air feels cool on your cheeks. You realize that seventh civilization can be understood in a simple, mainstream, safe way too. Most historians agree that many complex societies existed before the modern era in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, and countless others, each with its own timeline. Archaeology suggests that human ingenuity has flowered in many places repeatedly, and the evidence we do have points to the truth that no civilization is born from nothing. We inherit tools, crops, stories, and ways of organizing life. And then because it's bedtime, you let the cinematic what if return, but only as gentle imagination. What if seventh is a reminder to build with care, because many worlds have come and gone. Not six in a neat line, Not 6 secret empires, but many chapters of human living, some bright, some strained, all fragile. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the biggest clue might be the simplest humans repeat patterns. We get clever, we get comfortable, we get careless, we rebuild. Historians still argue whether the best metaphor for civilization is progress cycle or network. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. You don't need a single metaphor to fall asleep. You just need one gentle image to hold on to. So you choose the gentlest one, the reed stylus. You imagine it again pressed into clay, leaving a mark that will harden and wait. That mark is not only a record of grain and goats, it's a record of a mind trying to make order, a mind trying to carry something forward. Now the pacing begins to slow and your vocabulary softens and your sentences lengthen, because this is the wind down the part where your thoughts stop marching and start drifting. You are standing at the edge of the fields and the canal water moves beside you like a quiet companion. The city behind you is mostly dark now, with only a few lamps still glowing small warm dots in the night. The wind is mild and it brushes past your ears with a sound like a whisper, as if the world is telling you it's safe to rest. You let your shoulders loosen. You let your jaw unclench. You let your hands stop doing that thing where they hold tension for no reason, like you're bracing for an imaginary responsibility. You remind yourself gently that some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And that is not a problem. That is how a long human story stays alive. Solid ground and mist, facts and meaning, evidence and wonder will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You look up at the stars and let them be only stars, not messages, not warnings, not puzzles you have to solve tonight. Just distant lights that have watched countless nights like this one. And you think about how every civilization, whatever number you want to call it, had people who got tired, people who worried about water, food, family, and tomorrow, people who laughed at small jokes, people who told stories to make the night feel less empty, people who looked up and felt small, and for a moment felt okay with being small. You listen to the water again. You imagine the soft scratch of the stylus far away fading. You imagine the gentle weight of a clay tablet in your hand, not heavy, just real enough to remind you that humans have always tried to leave something behind, even if it's only a mark that says, I was here, I counted, I cared, I remembered. And now you don't need the mystery to resolve. You don't need the number to be perfect. You don't need the past to line up like a neat row of labelled boxes. You can let it be layered. You can let it be incomplete. You can let it be beautiful in its uncertainty. The canal water keeps moving. The night keeps breathing. The city sleeps. And you too can let your thoughts drift slowly, gently like a small boat easing into calm current, with no destination required, only the quiet sensation of being carried.